Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński and you're watching Break the Fake. They make them, we break them, and tell you everything you need to know. Alright, ever heard of the Rozsotrudniczestwo? You probably haven't, so here is a quick lowdown. Rozsotrudniczestwo, a veritable mouthful of an acronym, stands for the Federal Agency for the Commonwealth of Independent States Affairs, compatriots living abroad, and international humanitarian cooperation. So yeah, it's long. Take your pick. Rozsotrudniczestwo it is, then. I mean, that's basically a no-brainer, unless you want to remember the whole name. It's basically a foreign aid agency, anyway, which also deals in cultural exchange, and that's actually going to matter. Anyway, its boss, Yevgeny Primakov, recently made a sensational statement. A well-known African private military company was involved in the opening of Russian houses in Mali and the Central African Republic. Moreover, according to Primakov, some of its employees were later funneled directly into Russian state structures. Now, this immediately destroys the myth about the exclusively cultural nature of the activities taking place inside those Russian houses. The Kremlin would usually say that these were places of friendship, language, and matryoshka dolls. But now it turns out that there are serious military interests vested in them. In other words, while you are learning to write Russian letters and posters or stuff like that, there may be a teacher from a private military contractor group standing right next to you, already eyeing opportunities for cultural exchange of a different kind. One that involves spreading Russian culture among people who never wanted it in the first place. It should be noted that Primakov's statement came after numerous reports of human rights violations by these same PMCs in Mali and the Central African Republic. Thus, Moscow's cultural diplomacy turns out to be an instrument not only of propaganda, but also of potential destabilization. Color me surprised. Primakov's statement confirms once and for all that Russian cultural diplomacy has long ceased to be just borscht and ballet. It now carries an armed component. The Russian houses in Mali and the CAR demonstrate that the Kremlin is ready to combine culture, propaganda, and instruments of force, turning them into the first line of influence where civil diplomacy usually does not reach. In other words, if you think you're going to a Russian language class, check to see if there is a PMC instructor standing nearby offering a practical survival course. And remember how, in the end, traveling to Russia for cultural exchange could have you end up rigged with explosives and ordered to storm Ukrainian trenches into Donbass faster than you can say Rozsotrudniczestwo. When Russian propaganda runs out of real arguments, it switches to creative free flight mode. The latest example is yet another new strategy from leading Kremlin propagandist Olga Skabeeva, who decided that simply shouting insults at Ukraine is no longer enough. Now it is necessary to take Tatar action and kidnap President Zelenskyy. Because if Trump did it with Maduro, why is Russia still waiting? Am I right?
Готов к тому, чтобы перестать давать туда оружие. Он готов, он не хочет платить за это. Он не знает, как ее монетизировать. Вот ему кажется, что он может монетизировать Гренландию. Ему кажется, что он может монетизировать Венесуэлу. Как монетизировать Украину, он не знает. Даже продавая своему другу и партнеру вот эти литиевые месторождения на Украине, он прекрасно понимает, что в них вкладывать деньги, пока там идет пальба и туда летит орешник, бессмысленно.
Но просто из этого следует, что мы теперь имеем право действовать жестче. А мы не действуем жестче.
Оля,
Или не действуем настолько жестче, как могли бы действовать
что
жестче.
Значит действовать?
Да как угодно, украсть господина Зеленского. Я утрирую и все же.
Я не знаю, может быть, это надо сделать. Я, кстати, года 3 назад вот в этой студии говорил, что, помните, все процитировали, я сказал, почему позволили министру обороны, он был один из первых, поехать в Киев. Зачем мы вообще позволяем европейским политикам ехать по европейским маршрутам на поезде в Киев? Надо этот поезд остановить. А может быть, неплохо бы, чтобы этот министр обороны проснулся в Москве. Мне так все процитировали, сказали, что ой, как это можно? А вот видите, оказывается, можно.
Трамп услышал и украл Мадуро.
Можно целого президента выкрасть, а уж подумаешь, какого-то английского министра обороны. Слушайте, вот давайте сейчас, опять же, вот когда я вас слушаю, мне кажется, что вы ближе к этому самому, к Посейдону по Великобритании. Не выход, уверяю вас, потому что мы вряд ли сегодня готовы с вами просчитать последствия. Равно как неправы те, кто уподобляются актеру Миронову. Я думаю, что нам нужно проводить совершенно сбалансированную политику в собственных интересах. Слушайте Небензию, который сказал: не хотите с нами разговаривать о мире, будем с вами воевать до тех пор, пока вы не поймете, что с каждым днем условия мира будут другими.
Skabeeva's toughness is something like a souvenir for viewers. It sounds nice, but lacks any kind of practical use. Her absurd statements turn into memes, and then the statements themselves become a tool for intimidating her audience. After nearly 4 years of full-scale invasion, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy continues to be on the front lines, visiting places such as Kupiansk to support the military and monitor the situation up close. Putin, on the other hand, as usual, remains hidden in his bunker somewhere in Valdai. This clearly shows the difference between reality and silly, absurdist propaganda. One leader risks his life alongside his people, while the other devises plans for kidnappings on live television from his cushy, swanky bunker, and probably watching live streams from Tehran with more than a little trepidation. If you thought Tinder was just about meeting dates at coffee shops, Trevor Reed's story proves otherwise. 4 years of service in the US Marine Corps, private contracts in Afghanistan, plus combat training wasn't enough to avoid a romantic adventure in Moscow that turned into a real-life Russian absurdity. In 2019, Reed flew to the Russian capital to meet a girl he found on Tinder. There was a party, alcohol, and suddenly he was at the police station. But Russia's hospitality did not stop there. The FSB decided the American Marine was the perfect candidate for a madcap investigative drama. Reed was accused of assaulting 2 police officers. There was no evidence, obviously. The investigator even cried because she herself did not believe the case's fabrications. Now, plot twist? A photo of Reed in his Marine Corps dress uniform standing next to Barack Obama was not considered proof enough of his integrity, according to the Russian court, but rather a bargaining chip. After 985 days in prison, harsh conditions, and the COVID pandemic, Reed was exchanged in April 2022, after Russia had already launched a full-scale war against Ukraine. Trevor Reed decided he couldn't forgive Russia for stealing 3 years of his life, so he went to fight for Ukraine, for a volunteer unit of veterans. Eastern Ukraine, reconnaissance missions and battles. Reed now lives in Texas, helping American families who found themselves in similar predicaments abroad, and is preparing for the publication of his memoir, called Retribution. So what's the moral of the story then? Well, Russia is weaponizing everything, and this approach clearly doesn't spare people looking for romance. And setting up honey traps has actually been one of Moscow's most insidious methods. That's some next-level catfishing there. A pretty girl on Tinder turning out to be an intelligence officer waiting to turn a romantic entanglement into something much, much darker. But then again, isn't that the perfect embodiment of what Russia is all about these days? The fakeness of Potemkin villages, the hidden truth of the nesting dolls, and diplomatic honey traps for naive leaders who would do anything for a pipeline. And behind all this is still, essentially, the good old KGB. So don't get catfished just because they have hidden all their dating-related red flags back in the 1990s. And with this, we conclude this edition of Break the Fake. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.